8,000 people witnessed what should have been impossible that October night, and not one of them would ever forget the sound a human being makes when 3 years of buried rage finally finds its voice. What you're about to hear isn't just a story about a girl who fought back. It's about the moment when perfection shattered, revealing something far more dangerous underneath. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It truly helps me reach others who need to hear these words. Drop a comment below about a time when you had to choose between staying safe and standing up. And if you'd like to support more stories that shine light on real human courage, there's a thanks button right below this video. Every bit of support helps me continue sharing these moments that remind us we're not alone in our struggles. Thank you for being here. The Roosevelt High School football stadium blazed under Friday night lights like a cathedral of Texas dreams. 8,000 souls packed into metal bleachers, their voices rising in that particular hymn of small-town hope that only exists when teenage boys in plastic armor carry the weight of an entire community's pride. Austin had always been football country, but Roosevelt High took that devotion to another level entirely. This wasn't just entertainment, it was religion, with the stadium as sanctuary and homecoming night as the holiest service of the year. Wendy Griselda stood at the edge of the pristine artificial turf in her red and white uniform, pom-poms catching the harsh stadium lights like tiny fireworks. At 17, she was everything Austin. Texas celebrated blonde hair that moved like liquid gold, a smile that could sell subscriptions to whatever dream you happened to be chasing, and the kind of wholesome beauty that made even cynical adults believe the world might still have some good left in it. Head cheerleader, honor roll, Harvard early admission, dating the starting quarterback, living proof that if you worked hard enough and stayed pure enough, the American dream would lift you up and carry you exactly where you belonged. But dreams, like glass, shatter when you apply the right amount of pressure. And Jake Morrison was about to apply more pressure than anyone should have to bear. Well, look what we have here. Jake's voice cut through the pre-game noise like a blade through silk. He emerged from the tunnel leading to the visiting team's locker room, flanked by 4 figures who moved with the casual arrogance of people who'd never faced real consequences for anything. The crowd's energy shifted immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence. Parents pulled out phones, sensing something was about to happen that their children would be talking about for years. Jake Morrison had once been Roosevelt High's golden boy, star quarterback with a cannon arm and a politician's smile. Son of Mayor Morrison. The kind of teenager who seemed destined for greatness right up until the moment his sense of entitlement collided with reality. That collision had happened 6 months earlier, in the equipment room behind the gymnasium. When Jake decided that Wendy Griselda owed him something she had no intention of giving. "Jake," Wendy said, her voice steady despite the 8,000 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on her. "Whatever this is, it doesn't need to happen here." "Oh, but it does," Jake replied, pulling out his phone and opening a live stream. "See, you made it public when you ran to Principal Watson with your little stories, when you tried to destroy my reputation. Stories, as if sexual assault was fiction." The first wave of humiliation came in the form of sound Wendy's voice, distorted and chopped up, playing through speakers Jake had somehow connected to the stadium's audio system. Words stolen from different conversations, spliced together with the precision of a criminal prosecutor and the ethics of a sociopath. I think I'm better than everyone in this trashy town. These people are so stupid. I can't wait to get away from all these losers." Each fabricated phrase hit like a physical blow. Wendy felt the crowd's love transforming into something uglier. Whispers starting in the stands like brush fires catching wind. But Jake wasn't finished. Not even close. "Derek, Marcus, help our star student understand in her position." Derek Heyman and Marcus Chen stepped forward, both 6 feet tall, both carrying the kind of muscle that comes from 4 years of high school athletics and absolutely zero conscience. Their hands found Wendy's shoulders, pressing down with just enough force to send a message to everyone watching. Resistance was futile. "Kneel," Jake commanded, his phone camera capturing every second. "Show this town what you really are." The word hung in the October air like poison gas. 8,000 people held their breath, and somewhere in the silence, a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. Wendy looked up at the crowd, her crowd, the people who'd cheered her name for 3 years, and saw something that made her stomach drop. They were enjoying this. Some were horrified. Yes, but too many wore expressions of hungry anticipation, waiting to see their perfect princess finally brought low. That's when she noticed the bottles. Tommy Walsh and Brad Hawkins were unscrewing the caps on what looked like water bottles. But the smell that reached her nose was definitely not water. Toilet water. They'd actually brought toilet water to dump on her in front of 8,000 people. "This is what happens," Jake said, raising his voice so the crowd could hear. "To girls who think they're too good for the Morrison family." The liquid hit her like ice water, soaking through her uniform and into her skin. The smell was overwhelming, humiliating, in a way that went beyond physical discomfort into something primal and degrading. But they still weren't finished. Marcus produced a pair of scissors and grabbed the hem of Wendy's cheerleader skirt. The sound of fabric tearing was audible even in the cheap seats, and camera phones came out en masse as her uniform, the symbol of everything she'd worked for, was systematically destroyed. "Smile for the camera, princess," Jake said, broadcasting her humiliation live to an audience that was growing by the second. "Show everyone who you really are." That's when the image appeared on the stadium's giant screen. Emma Griselda's face, sweet and innocent, with words superimposed across it in cruel red letters. "This is what happens to Griselda girls who think they're too good for us." 8,000 people saw it. 8,000 people watched Wendy's perfect composure finally crack as her dead sister became a weapon in Jake's war against her dignity. And that's when something shifted in Wendy Griselda's eyes. If you'd been watching closely, really watching, you might have noticed her hands slowly curl into fists. You might have caught the subtle change in her posture, weight distributing in a way that had nothing to do with cheerleading and everything to do with something darker. Something she'd kept buried for 3 long years. But Jake Morrison wasn't watching that closely. He was too busy savoring what he thought was his moment of complete victory. "Now, apologize," he said, "on your knees, in front of everyone. Apologize for being a lying little—" "No." The word cut through the stadium noise like a gunshot. "What did you say?" "I said no. Jake, I'm done." Wendy stood up slowly, toilet water dripping from her ruined uniform, and for the first time in 3 years, she looked like someone who remembered what it felt like to be dangerous. "You want to know who I really am?" she said, her voice carrying to the back rows without the aid of microphones. "You want to see what's underneath all this perfection?" She reached behind her head and pulled the elastic from her carefully styled hair, letting it fall loose around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but somehow it transformed her entire appearance. Gone was the perfect cheerleader. In her place stood someone harder, more real, infinitely more threatening. "My name is Wendy Griselda," she said, looking directly into Jake's phone camera. "And for the past 6 months, these boys have been systematically destroying my life because I refused to let their leader rape me." The crowd's collective gasp was audible from the parking lot. "I reported it to the school," she continued. "I tried to handle it through proper channels. I did everything I was supposed to do. But sometimes the system protects the predators instead of the victims." Jake's confident smirk was starting to falter. This wasn't going according to script. "Sometimes," Wendy said, rolling her shoulders in a way that made her ruined uniform suddenly look like battle armor. "Good girls have to stop being good." That's when she told them who she used to be. 3 years earlier. "Emma, hold the bag steady." 14-year-old Wendy Griselda's right cross rattled the heavy bag hanging in their garage with enough force to make the rafters shake. She was small for her age, but she hit like she meant it, because she did. "Why can't I learn too?" 13-year-old Emma asked, steadying the bag with her tiny hands. "Because you're too little. And because Mom would murder me if I taught you to fight." "But what if someone tries to hurt me?" Wendy stopped punching and looked at her sister, really looked at her. Emma was delicate in the way that seemed to invite protection, with the kind of innocent face that made adults automatically want to keep her safe. In Wendy's experience, that kind of innocence also attracted predators. "Tell you what," Wendy said, unwrapping her hands. "I'll teach you just enough to get away. But you promise me you only use it if you absolutely have to." Emma's eyes lit up. "I promise." That conversation happened on a Tuesday. Emma died the following Saturday. The police report called it a vehicular accident. Emma had been walking home from her friend Sarah's house when Brad Hawkins ran the red light at Maple and 5th in his pickup truck. He'd been drinking at a party. He'd been texting his girlfriend. He'd been doing 45 in a 25 zone. But the report didn't mention that Brad had been harassing Emma at school for weeks. It didn't mention that he'd cornered her in the bathroom the day before and tried to force himself on her, or that she'd fought back exactly like Wendy had taught her. It didn't mention that 3 witnesses saw Brad accelerate when he spotted Emma in that crosswalk. The report called it an accident because Brad Hawkins's father owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties and played golf with the judge every Sunday. Wendy knew better. She also knew that pursuing the truth would destroy what was left of her family. Her father's position as deputy police chief was already precarious. Too many people thought Robert Griselda was too honest for his own good. Her mother was barely holding together after losing her youngest daughter. So Wendy made a choice that would define the next 3 years of her life. She decided to become exactly what everyone expected her to be. Perfect daughter, perfect student, perfect cheerleader, perfect girlfriend to the perfect quarterback. She buried her rage beneath layers of achievement and artificial sweetness, telling herself that being good would somehow honor Emma's memory. She quit martial arts, donated her trophies to Goodwill, burned her training gear in the backyard fire pit while her parents slept, watching 3 years of dedication turn to ash and smoke. And she made her mother a promise that seemed sacred at the time. "I will never hurt anyone the way we've been hurt." For 3 years, Wendy Griselda kept that promise. She smiled when she wanted to scream. She turned the other cheek when she wanted to break faces. She became Roosevelt High's golden girl, proof that good things still happen to good people in a world that seemed increasingly determined to prove otherwise. But promises, even the most sacred ones, sometimes have to be broken. And Jake Morrison was about to learn why. "You see," Wendy said, her voice carrying across the silent stadium, "before I decided to be perfect, I was something else entirely." She looked directly at Jake, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she saw real fear in his eyes. "I was the junior MMA champion for the state of Texas 3 years running. I had 17 amateur fights and won 16 of them. The one I lost was because I got cocky and didn't respect my opponent." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "I stopped fighting after Emma died because I thought violence was what killed her. I thought if I just became good enough, sweet enough, perfect enough, maybe I could prevent other people from getting hurt." Wendy's hands moved to the small of her back, where she'd taped something earlier that evening, something she'd retrieved from her old gear bag in the garage, something she'd hoped never to need again. "But you know what I learned tonight?" she said, pulling out a simple black hair tie. "Some people only understand one language." The way she used that hair tie to pull her blonde hair into a tight ponytail somehow completed her transformation from victim to something far more dangerous. "Last chance, Morrison," she said, her stance shifting into something Jake's privileged brain couldn't quite process. "Walk away now, and maybe we can pretend this never happened." Jake's response was to laugh, a sound that echoed across the stadium and would haunt him for the rest of his considerably shortened social life. "You think you can threaten me? You're nothing, Griselda. Just another small-town girl who needs to learn her place." "You're right," Wendy said softly. "I am just a small-town girl." Then her voice hardened into something that made the stadium lights seem dimmer. "But I'm a small-town girl who just watched you put my dead sister's picture on that screen to humiliate me. I'm a small-town girl who spent 6 months watching you systematically destroy my life because your ego couldn't handle being told no." She took a step toward him, and Jake unconsciously stepped back. "Most importantly, I'm a small-town girl who just remembered that sometimes good people have to do terrible things to protect themselves and others from monsters." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. 8,000 people waited for someone to blink first. Jake Morrison tried to maintain his composure, but his hands were shaking as he held his phone. "You're crazy if you think—" But he never finished the sentence, because that's when Wendy Griselda decided to keep a different kind of promise, the kind written in blood and justified by 3 years of buried rage, the kind that would make 8,000 people gasp in disbelief. "Derek," Jake said, his voice no longer quite as steady. "Marcus, Tommy, Brad, I think it's time we taught Miss Perfect a lesson about respect." The 4 boys spread out around Wendy like wolves circling prey, confident in their numbers and size advantage. They'd done this before, maybe not in front of 8,000 witnesses, but the dynamic was familiar. What they didn't know was that Wendy had spent 5 years learning how to handle exactly this situation. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying a tone that nobody in Austin, Texas had ever heard from their perfect princess, "you just made a very big mistake." The stadium fell completely silent, except for the buzz of overhead lights and the distant sound of traffic on I-35. Jake Morrison felt the first flutter of genuine terror in his entitled chest. Because the girl looking at him now wasn't the submissive victim he'd been torturing for months. This was someone else entirely. Someone who looked very much like she was about to keep a promise written in violence. And somewhere in the crowd. Deputy Chief Robert Griselda recognized the look in his daughter's eyes and whispered a prayer not for Wendy's safety, but for the souls of the boys who were about to discover what his little girl had been before she decided to be perfect. The reckoning was about to begin. The first punch would land in exactly 90 seconds. And when it did, it would change everything for everyone involved. But first, Jake Morrison and his crew were about to learn that sometimes the sweetest girls carry the most dangerous weapons not because they want to hurt people, but because they refuse to let people keep hurting them. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media, analyzed by experts, and debated in classrooms across America. But for Wendy Griselda, it was simpler than that. It was just a 17-year-old girl finally deciding to honor the promise she'd made to her dead sister instead of the one she'd made to her living mother. And Jake Morrison was about to discover the difference between those two promises was measured in broken bones and shattered pride. The attack came exactly as Wendy expected it would, coordinated, overwhelming. Designed to end this before she could prove she was anything more than a cheerleader with delusions of competence. Marcus Chen moved first, rushing her from the left with the kind of wild haymaker that worked great against other drunk teenagers, but was laughably telegraphed to someone with actual training. Wendy saw it coming 3 steps before he threw it, sidestepped with liquid grace, and drove her elbow into his solar plexus with surgical precision. The sound Marcus made part gasp, part whimper carried across the stadium like a prayer for mercy. 5 seconds, Wendy announced calmly, watching the mayor's nephew crumple to the artificial turf. Not my best time, but acceptable. Derek Heyman came next, learning absolutely nothing from Marcus's mistake. He charged straight ahead, confident that his size advantage would be enough to overwhelm her. Derek had 40 pounds on Wendy and 6 inches of reach, which should have been decisive. It wasn't. Wendy went low, sweeping his legs while simultaneously driving her knee up into his descending face. The impact was audible in the cheap seat's bone meeting cartilage, with the kind of wet crunch that made parents cover their children's eyes. Derek hit the turf hard and stayed there, blood streaming from his nose. 15 seconds, Wendy said, checking the stadium clock. Still rusty. Tommy Walsh had the good sense to hesitate, watching his 2 friends writhe on the ground while their supposed victim stood over them without even breathing hard. But Jake was screaming at him now, and peer pressure had gotten Tommy into worse situations before. He pulled out the knife. The crowd's collective gasp was audible from the parking lot. This had just escalated from schoolyard justice to something much more serious, and everyone knew it. But Wendy's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked disappointed. Really, Tommy, she said, her stance shifting slightly. You want to bring weapons into this? Tommy lunged forward, the blade catching the stadium lights as it arced toward her ribs. What happened next was almost too fast for the human eye to follow. Wendy's left hand caught Tommy's wrist, controlling the weapon with the kind of grip strength that came from years of grappling training. Her right hand found his elbow joint and applied pressure in precisely the direction human arms weren't designed to bend. Tommy screamed a high, keening sound that made everyone in the first 10 rows wince in sympathetic pain. The knife clattered to the turf as Wendy smoothly transitioned into a submission hold that dropped him to his knees. "Yield," she said simply. "I yield. I yield, Jesus Christ. Let go." Wendy released him and kicked the knife away, watching Tommy crawl toward the sideline, cradling his hyperextended arm. 35 seconds, she announced, including weapon disarmament. That left Brad Hawkins and Jake Morrison. Brad was swaying slightly, the alcohol in his system making him simultaneously more dangerous and less competent. He'd been drinking since noon, working up the courage for this moment. And now he was staring at the girl who'd just dismantled 3 of his friends like they were amateur hour. But Brad had a secret weapon that the others didn't. He genuinely hated Wendy Griselda. Not the casual cruelty of teenage bullying, but something deeper and more poisonous. Because Brad knew that Wendy knew what really happened to Emma. And that knowledge made her dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical violence. "You think you're so tough," he slurred, pulling a beer bottle from his jacket. "Let's see how tough you are with some glass in your pretty face." He smashed the bottle against the goalpost, creating a jagged weapon that glinted wickedly under the stadium lights. The crowd's murmur grew louder. This was beyond anything they'd expected to witness at a high school football game. But Wendy just smiled, not the practiced pageant smile Austin had fallen in love with, but something colder and more genuine. "Brad," she said softly, "that's for Emma." Then she moved. Brad swung the broken bottle in a wide arc, aiming for her face with drunken determination. But Wendy had been expecting exactly this kind of desperate escalation. She ducked under the swing, grabbed his wrist, and twisted until the improvised weapon dropped from nerveless fingers. Then she drove her knee up into his stomach with enough force to lift him completely off his feet. When Brad doubled over, gasping and retching, Wendy grabbed the back of his head and brought it down to meet her rising knee. The impact was audible in the upper deck. Brad collapsed like a marionette with cut strings and didn't move again. 58 seconds, Wendy said, not even looking at him. That one was for my sister. The stadium had gone completely silent, except for the buzz of the overhead lights and the distant wail of sirens. Someone had called 911, which meant this was about to become very official, very quickly, which left Jake Morrison. He was backing away now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The entitled smirk was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like the kind of terror he'd spent months inflicting on others. "Wendy," he said, his voice shaking badly enough that the microphones picked it up. "Come on, we can work this out." "We don't have to work this out," Wendy interrupted, walking slowly toward him. "You mean the way we worked out what happened in the equipment room? The way we worked out your little campaign to destroy my life? The way we worked out you putting my dead sister's picture on that screen?" Jake bumped into the visiting team's bench and realized he had nowhere left to run. The tunnel to the locker rooms was blocked by security guards who looked like they were enjoying the show far too much to intervene. "I'm sorry," Jake said, his voice cracking. "Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for it to go this far." "You're sorry because you got caught," Wendy said, close enough now that Jake could see the cold fury in her eyes. "You're sorry because for the first time in your entitled life, there are real consequences for your actions." "Please," Jake whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Don't hurt me. I'll do anything. I'll leave town. I'll transfer schools. You'll what?" Wendy asked. "Promise to be a good boy. Promise not to rape any more girls. Promise not to destroy any more lives. when your fragile ego gets bruised. She reached out and grabbed the front of his Letterman jacket, pulling him close enough that only he could hear her next words. You know what the difference is between you and me? Jake, I don't enjoy hurting people. I never have. But you've taught me something important tonight. Jake was sobbing openly now, snot and tears streaming down his face in a display that would be screenshot and memed across the internet within hours. Sometimes, Wendy continued, monsters only understand one language. And you, Jake Morrison, are a monster. What she did next wasn't technically a punch. It was more of a palm strike to his solar plexus, designed to cause maximum pain with minimal lasting damage. But the psychological effect was devastating. Jake Morrison, star quarterback, mayor's son, would-be rapist and destroyer of teenage girls, wet himself in front of 8,000 people. Then he collapsed, curled into a fetal position, and began begging in a voice that would haunt everyone who heard it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Please, don't hurt me anymore. I'll do anything. I'll confess everything. I'll tell them what I did. Just please, please don't hurt me. 73 seconds, Wendy said, looking down at him with something that might have been pity if you squinted hard enough. Exactly what I promised. She turned to face the crowd, 8,000 people who sat in stunned silence, trying to process what they'd just witnessed. My name is Wendy Griselda, she said, her voice carrying clearly without amplification. For 6 months, these boys have been systematically harassing, threatening, and attempting to destroy my life because I refused to let their leader rape me. The words hit the crowd like a physical force. I reported it to the school administration. I tried to handle it through proper channels. I did everything I was supposed to do as a good girl. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. But sometimes the system fails. Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are more interested in protecting the reputation of the institution than the safety of the students. Sometimes good girls have to stop being good. She walked to where Jake's phone lay on the turf, still streaming live to an audience that had grown to include half the internet. To every girl watching this who's been told to smile and take it, who's been told that boys will be boys, who's been told that fighting back makes you just as bad as them, I'm here to tell you that's a lie. She picked up the phone and looked directly into the camera. You have the right to defend yourself. You have the right to your dignity. You have the right to make sure that anyone who tries to take those things away from you faces consequences. The sirens were getting closer now, but Wendy didn't seem to care. I don't recommend handling things the way I did tonight unless you absolutely have to. But if you absolutely have to, she smiled, and this time it was completely genuine. Make sure they remember it. She ended the live stream and set the phone down gently on the artificial turf. Then the stadium erupted. 8,000 people rose to their feet, and the sound they made wasn't quite cheering and wasn't quite screaming, but something in between that sounded like 3 years of suppressed outrage, finally finding its voice. The first police car arrived just as the crowd reached peak volume. Deputy Chief Robert Griselda stepped out of the passenger seat, took one look at his daughter standing over 4 unconscious boys, and did something that would be quoted in newspapers for weeks. He smiled. That's my girl, he said, loud enough for the nearest news cameras to pick up. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough, in ways that previous investigations into Jake Morrison's behavior had conspicuously not been. faced with video evidence of their son's systematic harassment campaign and backed into a corner by public outrage. The Morrison family's political influence evaporated overnight. Mayor Morrison resigned on Monday morning. Jake was arrested on charges of harassment, cyberstalking, and attempted sexual assault. The evidence that emerged during the investigation, months of planning. Detailed records of psychological manipulation. Backup plans for destroying Wendy's college prospects painted a picture of predatory behavior that shocked even hardened prosecutors. Marcus, Derek, Tommy, and Brad faced their own consequences. Marcus lost his early admission to UT and his father's position as city controller. Derek's football scholarship to A&M was revoked when coaches saw footage of him bringing weapons onto school property. Tommy and Brad both pled guilty to assault charges to avoid trial. But the most significant changes happened at Roosevelt High itself. Principal Watson's resignation was announced Tuesday morning. Along with the entire administrative staff who had enabled Jake's behavior through willful blindness and institutional cowardice. The school board instituted new policies requiring all harassment complaints to be investigated by outside agencies. They also established a self-defense program, with Wendy Griselda as its first instructor. The viral video reached 12 million views before TikTok's algorithm caught up with it. Justice for Wendy trended nationally for 3 days. Major news outlets picked up the story, interviewing experts on bullying, sexual assault, and the failures of institutional protection. But for Wendy herself, the most important changes were internal. 3 months later, Wendy stood in the Roosevelt High Gymnasium, watching 23 girls practice the hip throw she'd just demonstrated. They were a mixed group, some popular, some not. Some who'd been victims of harassment, and some who were just tired of feeling powerless. "Remember," she called out, "the goal isn't to hurt anyone. The goal is to make them think twice about hurting you." Among the students was Sarah Martinez, a freshman who'd been dealing with unwanted attention from older boys. She'd seen the viral video and asked her parents to sign her up for Wendy's class the next day. "Coach Griselda," Sarah said after practice, "what if they're bigger than you? What if there's more than one?" Wendy smiled the real smile, not the pageant version. "Then you do exactly what I did, Sarah. You remember that being good enough doesn't mean being weak, and you make sure they understand the difference." That afternoon, Wendy received a letter that would join dozens of others in her desk drawer. This one was from a girl in Oregon who'd seen the video and found the courage to report her own harassment situation. The boy was facing charges. The school had implemented new policies. The girl was safe. But the letter that mattered most came from closer to home. "Dear Wendy," it read, "my name is Emma Rodriguez, and I'm 13 years old. I go to Roosevelt Middle School, and there's this boy who's been bothering me and my friends. He says he can do whatever he wants because his dad is important. Before I saw your video, I was scared to tell anyone because I thought they wouldn't believe me. But after watching you stand up for yourself, I realized I had options I hadn't considered. I told my parents. They went to the police, and now the boy is in trouble and has to stay away from me and my friends. Thank you for showing me that good girls can fight back too. P.S. I signed up for your self-defense class, and I love it." Wendy folded the letter carefully and added it to her collection. Each one was a reminder that sometimes the most important promises we make aren't to avoid conflict, but to make sure our lives mean something to the people who need to see that standing up is possible. 6 months later, graduation day. Wendy walked across the stage wearing her cap and gown, but also something she hadn't worn in years, a small silver bracelet with Emma's name engraved on it. In the audience, her parents cheered loud enough to be heard in Dallas. She'd deferred Harvard for a year, choosing instead to spend her gap year working with at-risk youth and developing curriculum for self-defense programs. Harvard had been understanding the admissions committee had watched the viral video too, and they knew exactly what kind of student they'd be getting when she arrived. After the ceremony, Jake Morrison's father approached her in the parking lot. He looked like he'd aged a decade in 6 months. "Miss Griselda," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for my son's behavior and to thank you." Wendy raised an eyebrow. "Jake's in therapy now." The former mayor continued, "Real therapy, not just court-mandated classes. He's been forced to confront what he did and why he did it, for the first time in his life. He's facing real consequences and learning real accountability." He paused, struggling with the words. "I know it sounds impossible, but I think what you did might have saved him from becoming something even worse. So thank you for having the courage to stop him when the rest of us failed to." Wendy looked at the broken man in front of her and felt something she hadn't expected: compassion. "Mr. Morrison," she said gently, "I hope your son gets the help he needs, and I hope you understand why it had to happen the way it did." "I do," he said, "and I hope someday you can forgive us." "I already have," Wendy said. "Forgiveness isn't about you deserving it. It's about me choosing not to carry anger anymore." 1 year later, Wendy Griselda stood on the Harvard campus, watching new students move into their dormitories. She thought about the girl she'd been before, that October night, the perfect princess who believed that being good meant being quiet, that survival meant making herself small. That girl was gone, replaced by someone stronger and more authentic, someone who understood that kindness and strength weren't opposites, but partners, someone who knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let others define your worth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Martinez, now a sophomore at Roosevelt High and one of the top students in the self-defense program. "Coach, there was an incident at school today. A boy tried to corner one of the freshmen in the bathroom. She used the techniques you taught us. He's in the hospital with a broken nose, and she's being interviewed by news crews about standing up to bullies. She said to tell you thank you for teaching her that good girls can fight back. P.S. His dad called the police to press charges, but the entire school is backing her up. Times have changed." Wendy smiled and typed back, "That's exactly what Emma would have wanted." She put her phone away and walked toward her dormitory, where a whole new chapter of her life was waiting. She'd kept her promise to Emma, after all, not the one about never fighting, but the deeper one about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. And she'd learned something important about promises along the way. The best ones aren't made to avoid conflict, but to ensure that when conflict comes, you're ready to meet it with exactly the right amount of force. Sometimes that meant being diplomatic. Sometimes it meant being kind. And sometimes it meant being the girl who could take down 4 boys in 73 seconds, while 8,000 people watched and cheered. And Wendy Griselda finally knew the difference. In the end, that October night in Austin, Texas had taught everyone who witnessed it a simple truth. The sweetest girls often carry the strongest weapons. Not because they want to hurt people, but because they refuse to let people keep hurting them. And sometimes, when all other options have been exhausted. That refusal sounds exactly like 8,000 people gasping in disbelief at what righteous anger can accomplish in 90 seconds. The cheerleader had found her voice, and the whole world had heard it.